Okay, so you're here because you like to get the real story right. I mean, you want to dig deeper and you want to figure out what's really going on with, well, just about everything. I get that. That's why you're here. And that's exactly what we're going to do today as we take a deep dive into a topic that I think is on everyone's mind. Cannabis.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. For years, it's been this taboo topic, shrouded in stigma, and now it's like this global wave of change is happening right before our eyes. We've got places like Germany just fully legalizing it, decriminalization efforts popping up everywhere you look.
Yeah, it's really remarkable when you step back and look at the big picture, isn't it? I mean, especially when you compare it to something like alcohol, which is perfectly legal, yet globally it contributes to 1 in 20 deaths annually.
That's a pretty staggering statistic.
It really is, and I think it highlights the complexity of the conversation we need to be having about cannabis. For so long, the narrative was very much focused on the potential harms, often to the point of exaggeration. But then, more recently, the pendulum swung in the other direction.
Right, right. It became all about the potential benefits, and any risks or downsides were kind of swept under the rug.
Exactly. And that's not really helpful either. The truth, as with most things, lies somewhere in the middle, doesn't it? And for a long time, getting a clear picture of the long-term effects of cannabis was incredibly challenging for researchers. Because when something is illegal, conducting rigorous scientific studies becomes incredibly difficult.
Oh, absolutely. You got all these bureaucratic hurdles, legal restrictions. It's hard to get access to enough participants to get meaningful data. So we ended up with this kind of incomplete picture.
Right, exactly. Criminalization really threw a wrench in the works in terms of scientific progress. But now, thankfully, as regulations start to change, we're starting to see a much more robust body of evidence emerge. And that's what we're going to explore today, isn't it? We're going to dig into this new research and look at cannabis honestly, acknowledging that it has both potential upsides and potential downsides.
Exactly. And let's start with something that I think a lot of people have probably noticed. Cannabis just seems a lot stronger these days. It's definitely not your grandma's weed anymore.
Yeah, that's a great observation. And it really comes down to THC. Tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, is the main psychoactive component in cannabis, the stuff that gets you high. Think of it as the magic juice. THC interacts with specific sites in your brain called cannabinoid receptors.
So like little docking stations for the THC molecules.
Yeah, you could picture it like that. When THC binds to these receptors, it triggers a whole cascade of effects in your brain. And the research shows a clear link between the concentration of THC in cannabis and the intensity of those effects. So the more THC, the more intense the high.
And it really feels like the market has responded to this desire for intensity. I mean, in the US, Canada, and Europe, the average THC content in cannabis products has more than doubled over the past few decades.
It's true. We're seeing a real shift towards cultivating and producing cannabis strains with these super high THC levels. And then you've got the rise of all these new products like edibles and concentrates, which can have THC levels well over 60%, sometimes even higher. It's a whole different ballgame.
Almost like comparing a light beer to like straight liquor.
Yeah.
Right? It's still in the same category, but the potential risks are just completely different.
I think that's a very apt analogy. And what's concerning is that this increase in potency appears to be directly correlated with an increase in cannabis-related problems.
Really? It's not just that people are getting higher.
No, it seems like the stronger the cannabis, the higher the likelihood of negative consequences. And this is all happening against the backdrop of a significant rise in cannabis use globally.
Right. In the U.S., daily cannabis use actually surpassed daily alcohol use for the first time in 2022. And Canada saw a pretty big jump too, right?
Yes, in Canada, cannabis use among those 16 and older rose from 22% in 2018 to 26% in 2023. Now, it's important to note that while some people might be quick to link this to legalization, the trend of increasing cannabis use actually started much earlier, in the 90s and 2000s, before widespread legalization efforts.
So legalization might be playing a role, but it's not the whole story.
Exactly. It's probably making it more accessible and maybe reducing the stigma, but there are other factors at play as well. So we're in the situation where more people are using cannabis, and the cannabis they're using is a lot stronger than it used to be. And this brings us to a really important topic that's often downplayed, the potential for addiction.
Yeah, for a long time we heard that cannabis wasn't addictive or that it was a much less serious addiction than other drugs. But that doesn't seem to be the whole story, does it?
Not really. It's true that a majority of people who use cannabis, around 8 out of 10, do so casually without developing any major issues, but that still leaves a significant portion, about 2 out of 10, who will develop what we call cannabis use disorder, or CUD.
Okay, so what exactly does CUD look like? It's more than just smoking a joint every now and then, right?
Right, CUD is when cannabis use starts to cause significant problems in your life. It's using too often, in larger amounts, despite negative consequences. People with CUD might find that they can't control their use. They might keep using even when it causes problems in their relationships or work. They might even start to enjoy it less, but just keep using anyway.
So kind of like a compulsion, almost.
Yeah, in a way. And there are three main risk factors that increase the likelihood of developing COD. How much THC you're consuming, how often you're using cannabis, and the age at which you first started using it.
So the higher the THC, the more often you use, and the younger you start, the greater the risk.
Exactly. And then beyond COD, there's full-blown addiction, which affects about 1 in 10 cannabis users. These individuals typically use cannabis daily, and their lives really start to revolve around it. They might spend most of their time using, obtaining, or recovering from the effects of cannabis, and it can really start to interfere with their work, relationships, and overall well-being.
And with that level of use, tolerance becomes a big issue, right? They need more and more to get the same effect.
Absolutely. Their brains adapt to the constant presence of THC, so they need to keep upping the dose to achieve the desired effects. It's a really slippery slope. And what's really unfortunate is that heavy users often start to experience a whole range of negative emotional and psychological effects.
Like what kind of things are we talking about here?
Well, studies have shown that heavy cannabis use can lead to increased feelings of irritability, anxiety, paranoia, even depression. It can also worsen pre-existing mental health conditions. So you might start using cannabis to try to feel better, but over time it actually makes you feel worse.
That's kind of a vicious cycle, isn't it? And there's
Yeah.
also a connection between loneliness and frequent cannabis use, right?
Yeah, there seems to be a kind of two-way street there. People who are lonely might be more likely to use cannabis to try to cope, and frequent cannabis use can also lead to increased social isolation and loneliness. It can make it harder to connect with people and engage in social activities, which can just perpetuate the cycle of loneliness.
It's like this downward spiral. And then there's this concept of mental numbness that some heavy users talk about, right? Where it's like they just lose interest in things they used to enjoy.
Yeah, that's a really interesting and concerning phenomenon. Chronic heavy cannabis use can affect the brain's reward system, leading to this state of reduced motivation and kind of a mental fog. Things that used to excite you just don't anymore.
So it's like it dampens your creativity, your drive to learn new things.
Right. Boredom becomes more tolerable, and you might just find yourself content to sit around and passively consume media or engage in less stimulating activities. And this can make it even harder to quit because everything just feels so dull and unrewarding without the cannabis.
So it's like you're not really dealing with your problems, you're just kind of numbing yourself to them.
Yeah, exactly. And that can really stall personal growth. If you're not feeling those negative emotions, you're less likely to confront the underlying issues and work through them. You're just kind of stuck. And then, of course, there are the physical withdrawal symptoms that come with quitting heavy cannabis use.
Oh, right. So what does that typically look like for someone trying to quit?
Well, the severity of withdrawal symptoms depends on how much and how often someone was using. But some common symptoms include headaches, sweating or chills, decreased appetite, and in more severe cases, even fever, nausea, or abdominal pain. Sleep can be really disrupted too. You might have insomnia or really vivid, disturbing dreams.
This is pretty rough. How long does this usually last?
Usually, the worst of it peaks within the first few days and then gradually subsides over a week or two. Most people are back to normal within a few weeks, but it can vary depending on your metabolism and your history of cannabis use. So we've talked about the emotional and psychological impacts, but what about the long-term effects of cannabis on the brain? I know there's been a lot of debate about this.
Yeah, it seems like there's still a lot we don't know for sure.
That's true. The research is still ongoing, and there's no definitive consensus on whether cannabis causes permanent structural damage to the brain. We know that THC interacts with key brain systems and that there's some evidence of potential structural alterations, but whether these changes are reversible after quitting is still being studied.
But even if the long-term structural damage is unclear, are there still cognitive downsides that heavy users might experience?
Yes, absolutely. There's pretty strong evidence linking heavy cannabis use to problems with memory, learning, attention span, decision-making, and impulse control.
So it can really affect your ability to think clearly and function in everyday life.
It can, yeah. And while many of these cognitive impairments seem to improve after quitting, it does highlight the potential risks of heavy chronic use. And I think it's especially important to talk about the effects of cannabis on teenagers because their brains are still developing and they're much more vulnerable to the negative impacts.
Right, the research on adolescent brain development is pretty clear, isn't it?
It is. Teenagers who use cannabis heavily are much more likely to become addicted later in life. They're also at increased risk of problems in school, mental health issues like depression and anxiety, and even psychosis.
So the message for teenagers is pretty clear.
Yeah.
Cannabis is just not worth the risk.
Exactly. The potential consequences are just too great. Now, stepping back for a moment, it's interesting to consider the whole history of cannabis prohibition. It's clear that criminalization didn't actually solve the problem, did it?
No, if anything, it probably made it worse by driving it underground and preventing us from studying it properly.
Right. Criminalization didn't stop people from using cannabis, and it made it much harder to have honest, open conversations about the risks and harms. Legalization, while not without its own challenges, at least opens the door for a more science-based approach to understanding and mitigating those risks.
So the bottom line seems to be that while most adults can probably use cannabis moderately without major issues, it's not risk-free, and there are certain things that make those risks a lot higher, like high THC potency and early age of use.
Exactly. And while the exact numbers are still being debated, it's safe to say that a significant minority of cannabis users, maybe 1 to 3 out of every 10, will experience some level of problematic use. So it's definitely not something to take lightly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the key takeaway is that we're still learning a lot about cannabis, and it's important to stay informed and make responsible choices.
Absolutely. Especially as it becomes more widely available, we need to be having honest conversations about both the potential benefits and the potential harms.
So here's a final thought for you to consider. Given everything we've talked about today, what does responsible cannabis use look like to you? How do we, as individuals and as a society, navigate this new landscape in a way that minimizes harm and promotes well-being? It's a complex question with no easy answers, but it's a conversation we need to be having.